Hey, this is Benjy Sarlin here, and I'm with Dan Foster from the National Review. We're here to talk. What are we talking today, Dan?
Well, I think there's some local news items about presidential hopeful Herman Cain that we might pick into first.
Right, some obscure stuff in the trade publications, I believe. Yeah,
that's right. Real sort of inside baseball kind of stuff about the minutia of his campaign operations and things like that. So why don't we start there? I mean, I'll give you my kind of forest level view of the whole thing, and you can tell me what you think about it. I don't think that there are any winners at all in this thing so far. I mean, I do think that there's a sense in which, so just taking the last two things I read about it. One is that one of the original political accusers, Kraushaar, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Karen Kraushaar, I believe it's tough to pronounce.
Has been identified, has come forward, and so now the Oppo research has started on her. There was an AP story about how she's got a kind of history of filing work-related claims. She filed a claim while at INS that wasn't a sexual harassment claim, but it was a discrimination claim. And if reports from people who worked with her and dealt with a claim at INS are true, she was basically upset that she wasn't allowed to work from home after a car accident that she had, and she asked for everything from a promotion to restituted leave to a one-year fellowship at the Kennedy School at Harvard, which I don't know how that would work out. But so here we have a woman who might have a kind of, not even to say that she wasn't discriminated against or that Herman Cain didn't sexually harass her. No, we don't know. But here we have a woman who's got a record of this sort of thing. And so it seems like every time a new allegation comes up about Cain, there's some countervailing force that puts the credibility of that claim into question. So we have, there's certainly, five accusers, 5 cases. That's where there's smoke, there's fire sort of thing. On the other hand, every time one of these allegations comes forward, we're not really getting details about what was alleged to happen or corroborating facts about what happened. There always seems like there's a wrinkle in every new thing we hear about Cain. So that's the last thing I read. The second to last thing I read, on the other hand, is Mark Block, Herman Cain's now infamous campaign manager, going on Fox last night and saying that this accuser was the mother of a Politico reporter. And as Dave Weigel pointed out in his blog this morning, there's no part of that sentence that's true. There was a Politico reporter who shared this woman's last name, who now works at National Journal, and is in fact not the son of this woman. But Mark Block went on national television last night and said not only that this was the case, but that he had confirmed that this was the case. But the reporter had never heard anything from him. There's no indication at all that any real live investigating or reporting or vetting of this information was done. So we have, this is just the latest in a series of missteps by Block. It looks like the greatest thing he's done for the campaign so far is taking a pull on that cigarette. He just seems completely inept. And so, and I think Cain's fallen into the same boat. I mean, he's dealt with some of these. He's dealt with some of these allegations. I thought the press conference was basically good from a messaging standpoint, although it had its weird moments. Everything with Cain seems to have its weird moments. So I'm babbling on here, and I want to get to what you think about it. But my point is that coming from the right on this thing, I'm not. There just seem to be no winners. I mean, I do think that the media, for instance, last night at the press conference, every question was kind of one of these leading questions designed to elicit crazy, right? There's questions like, do you think this is a conspiracy? Like sort of prodding Cain on some of the iffier things he said about the Democratic machine being responsible for this. So I don't think the media has covered itself with glory here. The accusations have really not gotten much less vague over the 2 weeks the story has developed. I think Cain's campaign certainly has not covered itself with glory here. What's your take on it?
Well, I think in the press's case, I think this has actually been more measured than you'd expect. The situation that I think people were fearing when this first came out was that there'd be a bunch of creepily, anonymously sourced, really lurid things coming out, or just really vague. That didn't really happen. We didn't know any details at all about what happened other than what Herman Cain told us until that woman, Sharon Bialik, came forward, because the press was actually being pretty careful about this. They didn't put out the names. They just said that there were these settlements. There was very, very, very few details. I thought it was fairly measured, actually, compared to some other scandals, perhaps. But I think you hit on something right here, which is that Cain's putting himself in this tough position, which is that even if you don't think there's a lot to the substance of these claims, and personally I think having this many accusers in such a short period is some kind of sign. I mean,
it's indicative of something, yeah.
It's indicative of something. This just doesn't happen to people by accident randomly. I mean, most people aren't suddenly accused by 4 or 5 people in a 2-year span. But say you don't think they're credible, say for whatever reason you just don't buy it. What Herman Cain has said to handle this has been such a disaster that right there should be some kind of indicator that something's wrong. As you said, his first instinct from the moment this scandal started was first just to deny it existed. They just didn't return phone calls for 10 days while Politico told them what they were going to do, and then to immediately start lying. I mean, if not lying, then saying facts that were instantly proven untrue and that they had to later walk back. First, Cain hasn't even confirmed that there's 2 settlements. He still says there was only 1. These are things that have been confirmed in other papers too, and it took him a while to confirm the first settlement even existed in the first place. So this Mark Block line is really just of a piece with this, that their first reaction every time there's some new development is to say something that's just demonstrably untrue almost immediately, and then try to stonewall and avoid having to give out further information. It doesn't speak highly of the guy or his campaign.
Right, and the other thing about that is that at the end of the press conference last night, he said another thing. He said about the 2 settlements at the NRA. He said that this Crouch, I'm not going to get her name right. This K woman,
Mrs. K, yes.
That the only thing that he recalled from her complaint, actually having done, is "you're the same height as my wife" thing, and I just gestured on the video in case you couldn't see. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to offend you with that. And yet she says that was such an innocuous incident. This is almost a verbatim quote from her, from that AP story, or might be from the Politico story. This was such an innocuous incident that I didn't even include it in my complaint. So there's stuff. Cain's taking a very high risk strategy, I think, which is that,
to put it mildly, right?
Yeah, I mean it's high risk, but it could be high reward. I mean, the base of the Republican Party, the conservative base, certainly his natural constituency, think that there's mainstream media bias against the right and are inclined to side with Cain if this becomes a war between the media and especially a black conservative, which is why he was really quick to throw out the Clarence Thomas comparisons. Now, I should say that I do think that bias operates in subtle ways, in the mainstream media. I share that conviction with fellow conservatives, but I don't think this is, in any demonstrable way yet an instance of that. I certainly don't think that racism is the overriding motivation for the coverage of this story. But he's taken this really high-risk strategy, which is if he can make it about him versus the media, then he can win. But he's also, as you said, either lying or saying things that he hasn't, him and his campaign, I should say, they're either lying or saying things that they haven't really bothered to vet, and they're doing it at great velocity. And he's denied and denied and denied so much, and sort of relied on the fact that there's no smoking gun on the other side of these accusations, that there's nothing that's really firmed even one of them up to the point where it's just unarguable. So if that continues to be the case, well, he might be able to pull it off. But he's denied and denied and denied so much. I mean, he said, "I've never acted inappropriately with anyone at any time."
I know, talking about setting a low bar to disprove his credibility, right? Yeah.
Right. So he's basically, he might as well have gone out and said, "I'm a Boy Scout, I'm a saint, I defy anyone to prove otherwise." And so if somebody does, it's hard to see how he survives. But like I said, high risk, high reward, because we still don't. This story is kind of stalled out. Instead of, we saw it with. I mean, I don't think it's going anywhere, but we saw it with Anthony Weiner, that the story kind of, it stalled for a couple days, but then it accelerated, and critical mass was reached not to mix metaphors, but was reached rather quickly, and then we had a resignation in the space of a week. This story has kind of just maintained, I think, a kind of constant velocity. It's not. We haven't really. I haven't seen a tipping point reached yet, and I think that Cain's strategy, such as it is based around just sort of bold and brash defense. But like I said, if something comes out that's really hard and fast and corroborating, he's in big trouble.
I think in the sense that these are going to be he said, she said situations. There's not going to be anything quite as... There's never going to be something that's as objectively, okay, that proves it either way, that I think will just end the scandal like that. But I think it may have already reached a tipping point to some degree. The funny thing is that by the time we reached last weekend, I think a lot of people were starting to think that Cain might be okay in this, because there really hadn't been a single detail. There was no video of anything. No one had come forward. There was nothing that really quite stuck, and I think you were right that there was definitely a lot of sympathy for this idea that, oh, it's the media, it's anonymous sources, like, of course the media hates Cain. That at least on the right, is a very emotional argument, and a lot of people feel they've seen the show before. And I think he was starting to move forward a little. I thought it was going to be damaging, but I thought it was starting to peter out. But then when an accuser comes forward in person, I think that's the ball game. I think it just invites so many more questions. There's video of someone talking about this. You have very detailed and very intense accusations. It's beyond harassment.
Assault,
Assault, right.
Yeah.
And the big thing is that it just gets the ball rolling. Now, all of a sudden, another accuser, because, by the way, The Daily, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, outed her name, has suddenly decided she has nothing to lose by coming forward. So now you're looking at the prospect of at least two women going out with these stories. Both of whom say, I know what Cain says, but this is what they say for now. Both of whom say they have no monetary interest in this.
Right.
They're not suing. They say they're not going for a book deal or something. They just wanted to get this out.
Well,
seeing as it happened 15 years ago, it's hard to exactly label them opportunists. This is showing up on their doorstep unexpectedly because of this Politico story.
Right.
So I think that's going to keep it going for a while now.
Yeah, I definitely think if you get, imagine if all five of the women, or even four of them, or even three of them, if there's a joint press conference where they're just going into details about dates, times, facts, specific incidences, getting on record the exhaustive list of the things that he's supposed to have done, then yeah, that could be a real big problem. And it's a big problem. The other thing about the Cain campaign is, if anyone who's looked at it, it's three people. It's really, the national team is really three people. And one of them is Mark Block. We've discussed his shortcomings. Gordon, who's the communication
right, he just
guy.
showed up, Gordon.
Yeah, he's done a fairly good. Exactly, he's done a fairly good job, but he's just putting out fires all day long. And there's only so. It's funny because the dynamic is that the worse these accusations get, the better he's doing fundraising off of them. So maybe he can use some of that money to hire some better media strategists and do a better job fighting this stuff. But he just looks so bad. On this thing. The line that my colleague Kevin Williamson used about Cain after he came in for an editorial meeting, which to my great regret I missed. I missed the editor's meeting with him almost a year ago now. But the line that my colleague Kevin Williamson used about Cain way back when he was neither a force in the race nor a subject to much controversy, he was just kind of this interesting guy. Was that he wouldn't trust him to run a pizza shop, much less the presidency of the United States. So there is a sense on some quarters, there, right, at least around here, among some people, that that Cain's just not the sharpest operator. My own opinion of him is a little bit different. I think that he's I think he's actually smart in the traditional sense of that word, in the practical sense of that word. I think he's
the guy was a ballistics expert.
Exactly. He's a mathematician. Yeah. So he's smart in a lot of ways. The old line about Bush, you try to parse. George W. Bush was, you try and parse what smart means. Well, he's smart in this way, but not in this way. He's smart, but he's not curious. He's curious, but he's not intellectual. I think Cain is pretty much smart by every standard. I think he was a mathematician for the Navy. He was a successful businessman. He has a really good rapport, given the right conditions, on camera and with a crowd. He's good at all these things. I just don't think he has surrounded himself with the right kind of help in this race, and I don't think he understands the dynamics of a 24-hour news cycle and what the media, pressure is going to be like in a race like this. George Will had a great line that Herman Cain is strolling for president. He's not running. And I think that's basically right. And we're really starting to see it. As much as that's refreshing to conservative voters, it's refreshing to me. I like the guy. We're really starting to see the consequences of running this unconventional, as they like to say, campaign.
Right, and I think it's fair to say also, you can be a very, very smart guy, a genius in fact, and act like an idiot a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's easy to see where it's coming from with Herman Cain, too, who I do think is a smart guy. Every politician on some level, especially those running for president, it doesn't matter your party, everyone, is on some level an egomaniac. I mean, you'd have to be the biggest egomaniac to think that you should be in charge of running the free world. Right. I mean, it's just a necessary prerequisite. But Herman Cain is really on some next level stuff. I don't know if you read his book, but it is enlightening. I was thinking of just trying to do a feature out of it, like the top 20 reasons why Herman Cain is awesome according to Herman Cain. I mean, this book starts with just like a victory lap around his debate performance while he's still running for president, being like, treating it as if he's already won, being like, yes, look at my incredible success, and I had this really good debate, and Frank Luntz said I won it. And then it goes from there, just through his whole life, about how, this is not a humble guy on the most basic level. So I think what keeps getting him into trouble to some degree is if he doesn't know something, and everyone has to study up to be president a lot. It does not matter how smart you are. I mean, it takes a lot of study. When he runs into something he doesn't know, he seems to be so confident in his abilities, so confident in himself, that his reaction is just to dismiss it as like, well, if I don't know it, then I don't even need to. Right. That's where you get into things like that, Becky, stand, I don't care about the leader. That's a dangerous attitude, and it leads to saying some stupid things. So I think that's part of it. But then you get it with the harassment charges, too. There is some deep psychological stuff going on here, in that I think Herman Cain might really believe some of the inaccurate things he said about these harassment suits. Right. I think he just is so convinced that he can do no wrong that he just remembers them that way, or thinks of them that way, or has blotted it out. But either way, it's not a characteristic that speaks well of a presidential candidate.
Well, I think you're right about both the egomania necessary to run for national office, and we're starting to see, Cain started referring to himself in the third person last night, which is always a sign of...
it's a Bob Dole throwback right there.
Yeah, the Bob Dole stuff. So I think you're right, and I also think you're right that there could be a nexus between that and the kind of personality that's, that could sexually harass women, or at least be subject to claims of sexual harassment. I mean, I think that's another thing that's been uncomfortable about this whole episode, and that we haven't really done a great job on the right of getting into, which is relitigating kind of the political correctness that governs office interactions now, and sexual harassment. I mean, I think there's some people who are quick to say, well, as Jonah Goldberg had, he said the representative line of this school of thought from emails and stuff that he's gotten, and I've seen similar stuff from a group of readers, is, the guy made a pass, he took no for an answer. What's the big deal, right? I mean, and let's even leave aside for a moment the BLM woman who is actually,
claims are a little more,
is alleging actual assault. And so I think that there's something to that. I'd like to think that there's a virtue in the middle of these two extremes. So one position on the right is that sexual harassment's not a real thing. That's something John Darbyshire said on our website. Basically, it's not a real thing. It's a creation of the politically correct state and kind of a construction. And then the other position is that the other extreme is that hitting on somebody amounts to sexual harassment. I mean, I'd like to think that there's some virtuous mean here, that there's some middle ground. But, I mean, we do need to unpack the sorts of things we're talking about. I mean, I don't think that every time somebody hits on you, it should be, judiciable. It should be adjudicable. I don't think that you should have legal recourse every time somebody flirts with you. And you'd like to think that society were governed by some sort of standard, especially in a workplace where there are power asymmetries involved, and there's a power dynamic there, which is, going to lead to some people feeling intimidated and some people feeling pressured and all those things. I think that's all legitimate. But you'd like to think we live in a world where somebody makes a pass, and the person who is the recipient of this attention, if it's unwanted, says, you know what, I'm not interested, and you're kind of making me uncomfortable, please stop. And then if it continues, now we get the, we get the human resources department involved, and if it continues, we get the law enforcement. I mean, I just like to think that there's some continuum of sense about which we can deal with all this stuff. And that's another problem with the vagueness of these charges, is that I think people who are, who think that the culture of harassment and of my right not to ever be offended by anything has gone too far, and I certainly include myself in that camp. With these vague charges, or more serious charges that haven't been substantiated, that are really just he said, she said, we're inclined to kind of default into thinking that maybe this stuff was overblown, maybe these people are, take easy offense, or they didn't do, they overreacted, they didn't take the more sensible step of saying, hey, you're hitting on me, you're making me feel uncomfortable, stop hitting on me, you're a married man, that sort of thing. I think we're inclined to default towards that interpretation of things, whereas if we had, a better sense of what was actually said, we could actually make the judgment about whether or not, and that's what this is going to be. I mean, this is going to be a judgment call. I mean, if we hear what was said, the court of public opinion is going to basically decide whether this stuff crossed some sort of invisible cultural line or not. But
no, I agree. It's a good conversation. And I think this is one of the reasons it's important that this Sharon Bialik woman has come forward. Because up to that point, like you said, the details were vague. And I watched a lot of Fox News the last week. It was really genuinely upsetting because it took Herman Cain's word at the idea that the only thing that happened was this chin gesture. And so then the whole conversation for about 4 days was like, oh, this is ridiculous. That's not sexual harassment. Sexual harassment barely exists. It's just a bunch of humorless people getting offended. And that was the whole conversation. So if you talk to sexual harassment attorneys or people who have been through this, the Sharon Bialik story, whether or not it's true, is a pretty frequent image of sexual harassment, and that's really what happens a lot of the time.
So unpack that. What do you mean? So
what I mean is that a lot of these cases aren't... basically, sexual harassment exists. It refocuses the conversation that, okay, there is some behavior that we can acknowledge, crosses the line, and that we have legal protections against for a reason.
Right.
So a lot of these cases that come forward regarding sexual harassment are a lot closer to Sharon Bialik's than they are to this idea of, oh, someone made a pass at me or made a joke. But I feel like until we had these kind of details that we could discuss, we just were going by this vague notion that allowed commentators to, like you said, sort of, just only focus on the most frivolous cases and just assume that was, at this point, the face of all sexual harassment cases to some degree. I mean,
right.
Like you said, with John Derbyshire, there was a serious debate among conservative commentators over the last week whether sexual harassment is a, quote, thing. It wasn't just him. Rush Limbaugh was saying that what Sharon Bialik described might not even count as harassment either. Even if it's true, he was saying, oh, come on, we're now counting behavior as well as saying things, which is a definition, I don't even know how to unpack it. It's outrageous, but this is a real line going around on the right. I think you'd have to acknowledge.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I don't think it's been ably defended or convincingly defended, but I do think that, this doesn't have to turn into an argument about our cultural sexual mores or, feminism or any of those things, but I do think that there's a problem. In other words, there are things that are easy to adjudicate, and there are things that are easy to codify into law. Behaviors, assault is, aggressive, unwanted. We can define assault and battery. You don't even have to hit somebody to be guilty of assault. But battery involves you actually, connecting. So there are things that are easy to codify into law, and then there are things like this which are really just sort of subtext. I mean, so a lot of what amounts to sexual harassment is, as you said, not sort of easily codifiable. In the back of some legal textbook. I mean, so there's a sense in which that stuff. There's a sense in which I'd be happy to admit that sexual harassment is a real thing and exists, and that people feel uncomfortable. Mostly women feel uncomfortable in workplaces all across this country because their superiors or their colleagues are acting creepily. They're being creeps. I think that's a real thing. It's a different question about whether it's wise or smart to try and pack all that into some vague and amorphous and amebically expanding concept of my right not to be offended by anything ever. So I think that the kind of cartoon defenses of that point of view that you might have, heard on talk radio don't do that position, real justice. I agree.
I just think it's that conversation of the nuance. You're right. It feels like a separate conversation from what's going on this week.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's one that's been allowed to kind of happen based on just how vague these things have been. But we'll see. Like I said, Cain's put all of his chips on the table. He's all in. If something comes out that's a rocker, he can't recover from it. And there's a conversation among colleagues that you might have even been privy to, where people were wondering, why is it that every time there's a sex scandal with a public official, the script is always the same: deny, 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 and then as you're forced to back off certain things, we'll admit them in context, but deny everything else, and then and sort of this fighting retreat that never really works.
Anthony Weiner was the exact same way.
Yeah, I mean, and you have to tell all these half lies and strategic denials and untruths, and untruths to get out of this stuff, and it never really works. I mean, in some ways, Cain is doing that, but like I said, really, he's going bolder. I mean, he said, "I have never acted inappropriately with anyone at any time."
He said he never even knew this woman. I mean, all you have to do at this point is prove that they knew each other, and his credibility is already shrinking. It's
right. So
the bar is so low.
Yeah, it's kind of an all or nothing proposition. I mean, I guess that's sort of how I feel about it. I think he's either going to win this fight or lose it. I don't think it's going to be one of those sort of nagging, festering things. But some folks around here disagree with me. I think Jonah Goldberg wrote a pretty good and plausible post that, this is going to play out however it plays out. It's not going to lead to his withdrawing from the presidential race. And the effect on the psyche of conservative voters, primary voters, is not going to be immediate or necessarily conscious. But it's going to be one of those things that counts in the ledger against Herman Cain when people are going to vote in Iowa and New Hampshire.
I think that's fair.
And I think, and especially if you think like Jonah, and I agree with him, that he only had maybe a 5%, 10% chance at best of moving through the early primaries with a ton of momentum.
Right, and that's more generous than most estimates, I'd say, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, I do think he had a small but real shot of making a big. I mean, it all comes down to Iowa. That's the other aspect of this. Really, people should be polling the hell out of it in Iowa, because Cain's only path is to surprise everybody and win in Iowa, and get some momentum, going forward from that. So I do think that's a fair and plausible reading of it. That it's not going to be decided one way or another. It's going to kind of go to the cards as just one more issue in whether people decide to vote for him. Which, incidentally, if for some reason this is all trumped up or fake or unfair, or even leaked by the Perry campaign, which was Mark Bloch's line last week, if this all turns out to be true, then man, was it an effectively run counter-up by either the Democratic machine or the...
But again, I repeat this for the video, it's just, there's been a lot of talk about liberals and the Democratic machine. I don't think people understand how much the left wants Herman Cain to be the nominee. I mean, I really mean this. I mean, I just don't think any Democratic operative even thinks about it as a possibility. If they could make it happen, they'd move heaven and earth to do it, but I just don't think they even think about it. I mean, they'd love it. It would be the general election in their minds. It would be over. It's just you wouldn't even have it. We would just take 6 months off. You could donate that $1 billion campaign to charity or something, and then you inaugurate him again. It's so the notion that the left is driving this, I just don't buy at all.
Do you think that extends, just out of idle curiosity? Do you think that would extend to a, say, Romney nomination with Cain as his vice president, just for grins?
Do I think Cain would wreck the ticket, you mean?
Yeah.
I think it's very possible.
See,
I think the bottom of the ticket is getting more attention now that Sarah Palin especially after her run to prominence and then complete and utter collapse of her public image. I think people are taking that spot more seriously now. And Herman Cain, someone who is completely, I guess, untested, except he isn't really untested. He's been tested the last few weeks, and he's failed pretty much every test that's come before him. Whenever there's been any challenge or crisis, I think it would drag the whole ticket down. It would say a lot about Mitt Romney. Because, I mean, let's be honest. Yes, Herman Cain endorsed Mitt Romney. They're both businessmen. These are not two guys who normally would be running a country together or a business together. I just don't buy it.
It's a great sitcom premise.
I know. It seems more like a sitcom premise from some kind of odd couple than it does, an actual... I mean, can you imagine Mitt Romney, who's so careful and so cautious and always... He plans things out years in advance and sticks to his scripts, for their plan and their strategy. And that's how he ran business. That's how he wants to run the White House. Having this complete loose cannon around who makes Joe Biden look like, nothing. It's look like Virgil or something. I just can't imagine it.
Well, see, you make an interesting point, but I was going to say the exact opposite about Biden. I think if you're right that people are paying more attention to the bottom of the ticket. But the reason why I think a Cain VP choice, I don't necessarily think it's certainly not the safest bet. It's probably not the most plausible bet, but I can see scenarios in which it really, really helps a guy like Romney, because let's face it, if he wins the nomination, there are going to be a lot of angry and disaffected conservatives. And he's going to need, just like John McCain, maverick, moderate rhino, needed a conservative that people could get excited about as a shot in the arm in a general. And we'll be debating, at least people in our line of work will be debating for a long, long time whether or not Sarah Palin brought in enough lethargic conservatives and energized enough lethargic conservative votes to offset the people that she may have, the independents and moderate Republicans she may have turned off on the McCain ticket. I mean, that's, I don't know if it's possible to settle that definitively, but certainly picking a guy like Herman Cain for a guy like Mitt Romney would be the same sort of thing. It would be a signal to the conservative base that he takes them seriously and that he's going to try and appease them. And I also think watching a Herman Cain Joe Biden debate would just be so entertaining that I kind of
that would be fun. I'll admit it.
Yeah, and I think to compare Cain to Palin, I think Cain certainly has more of a mastery of kind of budgetary and domestic political issues than I think Palin did. I think that he's better on his feet. He has the same sort of appeal, same sort of all shucks, appeal and sort of everyman appeal. He's an effective communicator like Palin in the same way, but he's also sharper on his feet, and I think would do better off script in a debate. Yeah, he might give us a couple of gems that the left blogosphere would have a field day with, but I don't think he'd give any more than Joe Biden would, and I also think he'd say a number of things that were more substantive and interesting and off the cuff than a Sarah Palin or something like that. But
the more I think about it, honestly, the more I think it would be a disaster. Because for a couple of reasons. The best thing Mitt Romney has going for him is that he's really the only candidate right now, if polling data is to be believed, who has a strong claim to independence, to moderates. And a lot of that is saying is like, look, no one really likes me that much, okay? I'm not leading some massive phenomenon or movement or something. But I'm clearly a plausible president. I have the qualifications. I'm not proposing anything too radical here. And if you think the other guy screwed up, would it kill you to give me a chance? If you put Herman Cain on the ticket, I think that just completely destroys the entire argument. I think the argument, suddenly the whole campaign becomes defined by putting someone who is seen as really quite radical and really a huge departure from our historic image of what a president or vice president is and should be. I think it would just change the whole nature of the campaign and scare the heck out of independents. I think they'd be really frightened off that ticket, and immediately.
Yeah, this is an interesting transition here because I think that's just talking, just unscientifically surveying my liberal and moderate friends. None of them are really terrified of a Romney presidency. Some of them are even sort of think that there wouldn't be much difference between a Romney presidency and a Obama, second term. I think they're sort of both right and wrong. so much of what liberals, in my experience, dislike about conservatives, especially those on the national scene, is not necessarily substance but style. And so much of sort of vaguely politically plugged in, sort of everyman folks who have liberal leanings, they're just uncomfortable with kind of the way that conservatives and Republicans present themselves, the sort of public battles that they choose to fight. I don't know if they pay enough attention to the policy to have real strong feelings one way or another. And so Romney has the advantage, I think, of he might be a game show host and he might remind people of their dad, as some columnist suggested a few months ago. I can't remember who it was, but he's not really scary or God forbid Southern, in a way that upsets a lot of liberals.
It's true he doesn't push the same cultural buttons.
Yeah,
I think that is a part of his appeal.
Yeah, and so, but the interesting thing about that is that I think they're dead wrong that there wouldn't be major policy differences between Obama and Romney, and I think the latest example of that is that he's kind of unusually for him, boldly come out with this entitlement reform plan that's not, more than one or two ticks off of the Ryan plan, which Democrats had hoped to use to, gin up opposition to Republicans at the congressional level going in to 2012. I mean, so, and we should talk a little bit about where Romney is in all of this, and especially what this plan indicates about his strategy, going forward. We had an editorial up here praising him for this entitlement reform plan, which in short would transform Medicare to a kind of premium support system. Mm-hmm. What separates it from the Ryan plan is that he would leave Medicare as kind of one option, traditional Medicare as one option among many, but it would no longer be a straight single-payer program. It would be offered as an insurance plan for which seniors would pay premiums, heavily subsidized premiums, but they'd pay premiums just like any other insurance plan. So, and then he would do some things with means testing so that rich people aren't getting the same benefits as people who really need Medicare and Social Security. He'd block grant Medicaid. He'd do, in short, a grab bag of reforms that conservative policy wonks are basically pretty excited about. And as I noted when we put the editorial out, I wrote this post saying that, if anyone's ever had the incentives to run a stand-pat campaign based on comfortable platitudes, gaffe minimization, and not rocking the boat, it's been Mitt Romney. And he's really he's benefited from this Herman Cain thing. He's seen insurgent after insurgent kind of swell in the polls and then get taken down by their own ineptitude or by something.
Right, which makes them look better every time.
Yeah, makes them look better every time. I'm seeing it kind of informally reading our comments on the comment section of the webpage, emails talking to conservative activists that the inevitability of Romney might be kind of sinking in a little bit more, and people are coming to terms with what that would mean. Jonah, I think, put it really well that conservatives should really look at him as a tool, that his wishy-washiness can actually be a great advantage if he can be controlled, as it were, by the conservative policy consensus as president. If we can make him, I shouldn't say we, I don't include myself in the movers and shakers, but if the conservative policy consensus can make him owe them, then he could actually be an really effective conservative president. So I do think, he had every incentive to kind of just play it safe, which makes tying himself in a very explicit way to really politically risky reforms on the third, fourth, and fifth rails of American politics surprising, and kind of makes me scratch my head. I don't know why he's doing it.
I was surprised too, though it is worth noting, as you mentioned, there's a pretty significant difference between the Ryan plan and what Romney is proposing, which the details aren't out, but it sounds closer to Domenici-Rivlin.
Right.
So in this scenario, you still do have traditional Medicare to some degree. So it's a much easier sell in that seniors aren't quite being thrown to the mercy of the free market the way they would in the Paul Ryan plan. Some of the attack lines against that don't ring quite as true. But I agree, it's pretty bold to even bring it up. especially at this moment when there doesn't seem to be any huge threat to him from the right. You know, the only big guy right now is Herman Cain, and he's imploding right now, and isn't really challenging him too much on Medicare anyway. So it's definitely kind of, I think to some degree it reflects what Mitt Romney really would want to do. But I think there is also something to what you're saying, this idea that his wishy-washiness could be an advantage for the right. I completely believe that of all the Republican presidential candidates, if Mitt Romney were elected, he would be the one most likely to repeal large parts of Obamacare by a huge factor. Because he's so vulnerable on this that he'd just be completely cowed into it. You know, any deviation from that plan, I mean, I just think he'd make it his number one priority because he has to. You know, he really banked on conservatives believing him when he'd say, look, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take out Obamacare. It's the first priority. And it would be such a huge betrayal if right off the bat he switched to some other priority, you know, right as it was taking effect.
Right, and he said his first act as president would be to give waivers to all 50 states for Obamacare. I mean, so he has to do that. There's no world in which he can get elected and not do that. You know, although closing Guantanamo Bay rings a bell. But you're right. I don't think that he could back off that because he's so vulnerable. I thought you were going to say something else, which ties into what we were talking about, which is that, you know, he'd be the most, you know, the left might be scared of Romney because, not because he's vulnerable on Obamacare, but because he's the most, it seems like he'd be the most effective, manipulator of the federal, Leviathan of all the Republican candidates. There's this debate, and I've had it with Adam Serwer on Blogging Heads in the past, and I think it's really fascinating. Debate in the right. There's debate, there's a tension in the right between wanting to elect officials in Congress and especially at the executive who share our beliefs, share our small government philosophy, and as a result of sharing our beliefs and our small government philosophy, don't necessarily have what it takes to manipulate the massive bureaucracy that has become the federal executive. And some people are okay with that because they see the whole point is dismantling that bureaucracy or dramatically scaling it back. And then there are others, and I would put myself in this camp, who think that nobody's going to be able to roll back that monster at all unless they can master it. So, it's almost like needing a Gorbachev, before you get a Yeltsin, or maybe that, with the way Russia's gone since then, that's not the most apt analogy. But you need somebody who's at least comfortable operating inside the Leviathan in order to scale it back and bring it down. And I think Romney, among the GOP field as it exists, Mitch Daniels certainly have been better, and maybe a couple other folks. Romney has the best and most plausible claim to being able to say, look, I can play this game. I know how large and complex organizations work. I made a fortune restructuring them, making them more efficient, spinning them off, and I can do the same with the federal government. And that's a pitch that might be interesting for him to try and make more explicitly to people, because it certainly appeals to somebody like me, and I'm not in love with Romney, nor am I in love with anyone else in the field, but certainly I think it's plausible and true even that he's the guy who'd be best positioned to just kind of bend the system to his will, rather than just throw his hands up and say, blow the thing up.
Right, and on paper I think that's one of his biggest strengths, especially reaching out to the middle, is that he really, and it's a fairly compelling story, I think, a fairly compelling argument, being saying, like you said, look, my whole job was taking over businesses, making them more efficient, making them run, making them profitable. There's no reason I couldn't do this with government. It's just one big organization. I know what I'm talking about in dealing with it. I did in Massachusetts, and we just tweak things. We wouldn't be in there destroying everything. We'd figure out how to make it run more efficiently. So I think that's a decent claim. And I think at the core of Mitt Romney, given that he has changed his position so many times, I think that's why he wants to be president. I really think that's the most authentic iteration of him. That he really thinks he's the guy who can just show up and just make things run smoother. This very technocratic approach, less ideological than he's letting on right now. I think that's his core. The problem with Mitt Romney that I'd be worried about on the right is I think Obamacare is one issue where he's pinned down. But even there, Mitt Romney's been in a situation where the entire last 5 years of his political career, his only political incentives have been to just keep swinging to the right. That's always been the right move, because he's trying to win a primary for the last 5 years. Republicans have been moving to the right. It's just the only move that makes sense. Before that, when he was running for governor in Massachusetts, in every way he was running to the left, because it made sense then, right?
Right.
So the question is, what happens if he becomes president the first time that scary poll shows up, where, suddenly you're at 45% approval rating, and polls show they're really not so happy with that Medicare plan, or polls show they're really not so happy with the way you're talking about immigration. Suddenly he has a new incentive for the first time in 5 years. What happens? And I think that's a situation where it's really easy to see Mitt Romney turning into a moderate president very quickly. Because if history serves, that's exactly what he's going to do. No one really knows how much he's abandoned his old Massachusetts days, I guess. Is the issue that he had a late-life conversion to conservatism, or is the issue just that for the last few years it's been more politically convenient? So I think I could see a scenario in which Mitt Romney is the least scary president for the left, even though he's saying pretty conservative things, as you've said, with these plans, because he seems the most vulnerable to getting scared. And this is something that afflicts Democratic presidents too, right? A lot of Democrats are still mad at Bill Clinton for the first time his poll numbers started going down, bringing in Dick Morris and suddenly tacking to the right really hard. Or with Obama, bringing in Bill Daley, who's now turned out to be a bit of a disaster and they're sort of rejecting. So I think there's this fear that Mitt Romney would do exactly that. He has a few bad weeks in the polls, and then all of a sudden you're bringing in, I don't know who, David Frum to run things. Someone who the right really just does not trust.
Yeah, obviously that's a fear. I share it. I think the wild card here, and look, to be president of the United States, you can't, unless you really have the rhetorical powers of Ronald Reagan. And in some sense, Ronald Reagan didn't have the rhetorical powers of Ronald Reagan. But he was really, really awesome at getting everybody in the country to buy into his conservative vision for America. I mean, he was really great at simultaneously being president of the United States and doing all the sort of statesman-like, we're all in this together, the president of, Reagan Democrats. He's really, really good at that. But in running a generally conservative administration, but you really need to be good to do that. And I think, Clinton was good enough to do that. We could argue about how much of a centrist he actually was. I think it kind of varies from issue to issue.
Right, of course.
But, I don't know if Romney's good enough to do that. So it's a legitimate worry. The wild card, though, is that I think it's right, as some commentators have already noted, that the locus of power now in the Republican Party is in Congress. Even if they're not in the majority, they just control the House now. But the locus of power is really in Congress. And in Congress, the Republican Party is a lot more conservative than it's been in a long, long time, and also a lot more willing to kind of to buck leadership. And we've seen the limits of that on debt deal negotiations and things, and that leadership, and more sort of traditional mainstream Republicans, old Washington hands, have kind of had their way over the Tea Party and conservative factions. But with a relatively weak president who happens to be a Republican, I think that the conservatives in the House, and we'll see what 2012 does in terms of their numbers in both the House and the Senate, but majorities in Congress could certainly be powerful enough to kind of bend a President Romney to their will, I think. I mean, that's one way I could see it playing out. So that might be
the problem with that. You have no idea how long those majorities will last or if they'll ever be there.
Right.
When Obama was elected, everyone was working under this assumption you'd have huge Democratic majorities for at least 4 years.
It was 1932, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And yet, 2 years later, wiped out.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's always the possibility the same thing could happen, and then all of a sudden, Romney doesn't strike me as one of those guys who'd like to just sit around. I have a feeling he's someone who seems like he wants to get things done. I think it's just his style. It's how he thinks of himself. So I feel like if there was a Democratic majority in either house, there'd be a lot of pressure on him to come up with something that's quite the compromise.
Yeah, that's probably right. I mean, so what do you make of? I don't know how much we should put stock in off-year state elections as any kind of bellwether, but what do you think of last night there were a number of referenda on the ballot in different states. There were a couple of big recalls. There was one big recall, and some interesting results across the country. What's your kind of takeaway from that?
Well, I think there's a theme to pretty much all of these, and that's overreach. And I know this is an argument that the right used a lot against the left after 2008, and I think sometimes with merit, which is that you had a lot of governors in 2010 and a lot of issues that did a lot better than they normally would have been, or ideas that were more popular or seemed more popular than they were, because the economy was so bad and people were just so mad at incumbent Democrats. So I think this is just the latest example of almost instantly when some of the more conservative governors tried to implement this kind of agenda in moderate states, even in some red states, they really had a huge backlash that I think they did not anticipate. So SB 5, I think, is just the latest example. I mean, you would never know that just a short year ago, John Kasich was swept into office. It was this huge triumphant moment. And now his approval ratings are in the low 30s. His signature bills are getting defeated by huge margins. I mean, this was blowout margins. This is the kind of thing they're already worried this is going to come out and affect Romney a year from now because it's become so unpopular. Similarly, you've seen that with Rick Scott in Florida, who won a closer election, but it was a similar problem with Scott Walker in Wisconsin, who, he had some real progress, but it cost him politically just gigantically. I mean, there were these recall elections, they didn't go that well, but his approval ratings have plummeted a lot. And I think this is a theme that if ever there's a threat to Republicans in 2012, that's it. They're no longer just running against a field that's all Democrats. Democratic state houses, governors, the president, both houses of Congress. There are now actual examples of what governance looks like under the current iteration of the Republican Party. There wasn't before. No one knew what it was going to be. Was it going to be something like a Charlie Crist situation, or was it going to be the Tea Party? No one knew after 2008 where the party was heading next. But now that they have an actual example, I think that's something Democrats can really use. They can look, you took a chance on John Kasich. You want to take a chance on Mitt Romney? That's what the new Republican Party looks like. So in so much as they're representative of that vulnerability, I think they're important, but it's a year out. A million things could change. Right. So I don't want to say that this is some kind of definitive signpost here, but I think it's more of a warning shot.
Right. I think that there's a lot of plausibility in what you say. I think that the real lesson is that political skill really matters. And these things are all politics is local, is the old cliche, but it's operative here. And you see, in a case like Chris Christie, who is governor of a blue state, and who it's not a front page story because it's sort of predictable and not a game changer. But the Democrats maintained legislative majorities in New Jersey. There were some hopes among Republican Party operatives in New Jersey that they would, make a dent. And even, 6 months ago, a year ago, people were talking about Republican takeover. That didn't happen, but it doesn't make Christie's accomplishment there any less impressive, or I think make his hold and his chances for re-election and continued success any more tenuous, because he's been able to do everything that he's done with just force of will, with his personality, his sort of understanding of the power dynamic in New Jersey, his use of the peculiarities of the executive. So he's been able to use the system to enact really conservative goals, and he's also thrown enough bones to the center and the left in the country and been able to successfully appeal to them. You look at Walker, and who you said did take some political damage as a result of his program, but has not been defeated at any level. I mean, from the Supreme Court special election to the recall efforts to the actual passage of the bill itself. And I think that that's a testament again to him using the structure of the system in Wisconsin to his advantage and using it ably and nimbly. Kasich, Kasich I think is a fine guy, but has been much less successful. And Ohio's, a different place. It's a little more blue collar than Wisconsin. It's the union dynamic there is just a little different. And so I think local context really matters. The one that really surprised me was the Mississippi thing, and I didn't follow it closely enough. But
that was definitely the biggest shock of the night. Maybe it was just among people on the left and the center left just assuming that Mississippi will pass any conservative measure that shows up, and that was just not true. It still was shocking to see how badly this amendment, this very pro-life amendment, went down. I mean, it was really pretty big.
Right. Yeah. I think it's just it was a weird, almost philosophical question on and I don't mean governing philosophy. I mean philosophy. Question on a referendum that I think I don't know how I would have voted for it. I'm pro-life. I don't know how I would have voted on it. It's just it's a kind of a bit of a navel-gazing question, or kind of an armchair question that's being put up. When does is distinct DNA the mark of life, or what is it? Being put on a ballot that I just wouldn't feel comfortable voting on without sort of retiring to Oxford for 4 years to think about it. I think that's what happened there. But it is, the dynamics of that are certainly a little unusual. But I think we both agree, in summation here, that it's a year out and a lot could happen, and that this stuff shouldn't necessarily be taken as an indication.
Right. Neither side should take things for granted right now. Right. There's signs. There's definitely signs of encouragement for both sides right now.
Right. So let's sign off and see if all the predictions and analyses we made are slowly or quickly proven false by the news.
We'll put it in the time capsule.
Yeah.
Pick it up.
All right. Good to talk to you.
All right. Great talking to you, Dan.
Bye.